The new universal tree of life has provided us with a dynamic new context in which to understand and evaluate the long history of evolution of life on planet Earth. We want to see this in the context of three primary components. The first one is the long geological history of the planet over which this takes place, spanning from the birth of the Earth at 4.6 billion going into the modern day Earth environment. Earth itself was born at about 4.6 billion years ago. And following that, there are a series of events like the formation of the moon, but also there was an event called the maximum late heavy bombardment. And that event was where meteors hit the Earth at very high frequency. That reached a maximum about 4 billion years ago, and then it dropped off and more or less ended at about 3.5 to 3 billion years ago. The second context we want to see this in is the origin environment in which life would have started. And we believe these were on the deep sea floor. The third contextual component we want to deal with here is the idea of molecules of life transitioning from early ancient individual molecules of RNA into fully formed cells, and then the evolution into the three domains of life, the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya. Now to do this, let's start with the origin of life on the deep sea floor. In the mid-ocean ridges, hot molten material is coming up to the surface of the seafloor. It's creating new oceanic crust. And in these environments, very, very cold seawater is being pumped down and reacting with these newly formed rocks that we call basalt. When the seawater that's heated reacts with the basalt rock, it creates a new rock called serpentine. And this serpentinization is a hot chemical reactor environment in which we now believe that life would have originated. So we originate rock in these hot chemical reactors on the seafloor. And that life then quickly moved to something surprising. It wasn't life that had a cell wall as we know now, but it was actually life that lacked a cell wall. And in fact, we call that RNA-based life. It would have been the basic RNA molecules, but it would not have been a cell. And this is a fascinating time to think about because there were no individuals. Actually, communal activity, having everything be shared and moved around was the state of life at these early environmental times. Now, we very quickly transitioned from that at about the 4 billion year time frame into another type of almost a cell that we call the progenote. And that progenote was very different from modern day cells. The RNA molecules started to come together. They were very minimally encompassed by a membrane, but it was by no means a modern day cell membrane. And these early protocells, these progenotes, also were unable to do something very important that modern day cells do. They were not able to make proteins. Now we kept transitioning very quickly in this very narrow 100 or 200 million year time frame, going from about 4 billion years before present to about 3.8 billion years before present, into then a cell that was very much like what we have in the modern. And that's called the last universal common ancestor. And that transition from the progenote, we say that it is the Darwinian transition. And Luca is an important context because from that point forward, we moved from a life environment in which we were able to share communally all kinds of information between components because we had no individuals. There were no cells. Moving then drastically quickly into an environment where we had true cells, and those cells were able to create protein, and it changed the dynamic of the way that genetic information is moved. It wasn't just moved horizontally between others, but it was also moved vertically through the tree of life. Now, moving from Luca, we started off with basically two forms of cells. One of them were bacteria, and the other one was an early basic cell moving forward into the archaea and into the eukarya. And we call that the last eukarya-archaea common ancestor, LECA. Now, once that we got the three domains of life all come on board 3.5 billion years and forward, one of the first things that the early bacteria evolved was the capacity to do photosynthesis, to combine sunlight with CO2 and then produce oxygen and sugars. And that happened very, very early. Now, we think about plants for photosynthesis, but actually the basic capacity to do photosynthesis, that was all a product of early bacterial evolution. And in fact, it was such a successful type of organic mechanism to take place on the Earth, that it successfully flooded the Earth, the atmosphere, and the oceans with oxygen by about 2.5 billion years before present. Now, once the Earth was oxygenated, we had continued evolution within the three domains of life. We had no individuals, there was not competition, so to speak, and everything was free-flowing genetic information. And then once this was locked into the three branches of life, then we started transmitting genetic information vertically as well as horizontally. Then we bring ourselves up to a much younger Earth, and at about 542 million years before present, we had eukarya form multicellular organisms that could actually secrete a skeleton. And at that time point, with a very strongly oxygenated Earth, then the eukarya that we know now, going up into the modern day, the plants, the fungus, and the animals, all began to evolve towards what we see as the modern day assemblage on the stage of planet Earth. So this is the new understanding, the new context, the new exciting dynamic evaluation of how life has transitioned through geological time, moving from an early origin point on the deep sea floors as hot seawater reacted with rocks to create an environment where some of these early molecules could be synthesized and produced, then moving rapidly to the point where we had a fully formed cell, and those cells then diversified into three main domains: the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya. And then through a process of several more billions of years and into the modern, we see that the bacteria and the archaea, these are long-lived survivors of many, many different types of environments on planet Earth, which transitioned from being no oxygen to heavily oxygenated. And then at the very top of the last few twigs of the tree of life on the eukarya side is when we see all these organisms that we know and love in the modern day environment be experimented, evolved, and then coming into the modern day Earth system.